Hello, I'm Hans von Sachsen-Altenburg. Let me tell you about the historical context of a world-famous play and TV program. Many people know the piece only in one version, in which Freddie Finton plays a butler named James in the employ of a lady Sophie who's enjoying her 90th birthday. Well, I thought you might enjoy to know that there exists an actual historical precedent. Not only that the real lady was actually a relative of ours. Well, okay, she was not merely some lady, but a princess, and her name was not Lady Sophie, but Princess Caroline. In order to not confuse you, I shall continue to call her Sophie just for you. Remember, though, that was not her real name. She played a meaningful role in world history in helping to raise a young man to grow into a caring, charming, and responsible prince and world leader. Let's begin with a genealogical background. In the year 1764, Wilhelm, Landgrave of Hesse, married. Let's stop right there. You never heard of him before? Come on, of course you did. He was the one who became quite rich by selling mercenaries to his wife's uncle, King George III of Great Britain, to thwart a rebellion in the colonies. Got it? Although this coalition of the able and willing included soldiers from many other countries, American rebels collectively called them Hessians during the American Revolutionary War. So, one more time, Wilhelm got married in Copenhagen to the 17-year-old princess Wilhelmine of Denmark. Her father was the King of Denmark and Norway, and her mother was Mary, the daughter of King George II of Great Britain. There you see the connection to King George III. Wilhelm and Caroline had 4 children. Marie Friederike, she married Prince Alexis von Anhalt-Bernburg. Probably a name you never heard of, but the people in the Texas Hill Country might want to know that their daughter, Louisa, married in 1817 Prince Frederick of Prussia. You know him as the founder of Fredericksburg, and he was the brother of Prince Karl von Solms-Braunfels. Thus, if you will, their aunt was this Princess Caroline, who we now call Sophie for you. Who was married to Prince August of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, and we will talk some more about them in a little while. Their third child was Frederick, who died as a 12-year-old, and finally Wilhelm II, who became not only the prince heir, but also the elector of Hesse. He, in 1797, married Princess Augusta, the daughter of the Prussian King Frederick William II. So now back to Sophie, whose real name was Caroline. I don't really know why she did not get married easily like her older sister and her younger brother. Instead, she was already 29 years old when her father Wilhelm interfered in what might have been a love affair. More likely it was just an infatuation. However, with a slightly younger, dashing count in his employ. Well, 2 rules are forever. Boys and girls must not fool around with the domestics, And number 2, you keep your fingers out of the tilly. The Count was quickly sidelined, fired, and Sophie stayed single for a while longer. Yep, that's how it went. Equal rights for all. During the summer 1801, the Prince Heir of the Duchy of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, Prince August, visited Wilhelm of Hesse's court, and bingo! That man was maddeningly good-looking, which occasionally has its price. He was free-willed, knew what he wanted, and had the courage to stand against all of his relatives and in-laws in his submissive adoration of Napoleon, who had tried to enslave all of Germany, including his own homeland and all relatives. The German poet Goethe characterized Prince August as, and I quote, pleasant and repulsive at the same time. A dream of a man, Carolyne may have thought, and he was in need of compassion. After only 4 years of marriage, he had recently lost his wife, Louisa, the Duchess of Mecklenburg, following childbirth. She was only 21 then, and their only child, also named Louisa, survived. He needed a wife, and little Louisa a new mommy. In April 1802, August and Sophie were married, and 2 years later, the almost 30-year-old groom succeeded his father on the throne of the duchy. A famous painter once described her feelings, quote, "She is madly in love with him, and particularly admires his spirit." While she was hoping her husband would give her a child, Sophie was the fundamental influence in the raising of her stepdaughter, Louisa. Augustus, meanwhile, went hunting with the boys. In the beginning, they lived as a family in the palace of Friedenstein. As time went by, Sophie's husband Augustus increasingly recluded himself. That would have not been so bad, but when he entertained, he embarrassed the court and guests alike in frequently wearing women's clothing and impersonating women. It is said that dinner guests were in horror of being invited to the table, as one never knew on whom he would focus his unusual attention and play appalling jokes. Now don't be confused. Augustus simply liked men more than women, and over time he made ever less of a secret of it. After a while, the couple no longer appeared together in public. Sophie moved to the palace of Friedenthal, and her husband was so delighted that she had moved out that he signed over the property together with yet another one called the Winter Palace, and finally also the Little Tea Palace. Sophie also received several properties and rights in the city of Altenburg. For Augustus it meant one down and one to go. Okay, we'll do the mother-in-law later. He managed to have his daughter Louisa be engaged to a distant cousin one day before her 16th birthday, to a man 17 years her senior. The wedding took place 6 months later. 1 year later, Louisa dutifully delivered the heir, named like his father Ernst, and yet another year later the spare, Albert. The children spent most of their youths at the small estate castle of Rosenau, which was less stuffy and subject to protocol than the bigger palaces in town. They may have lived in a castle called Rosenau, meaning the meadow of roses, but for Louisa it was no rose garden either. Her father had liked too many men, but that was behind her. However, now her husband liked too many women. Grossly neglected, she began a liaison with the Count and was promptly, in the spirit of the times, punished by being accused of adultery. That eventually led to her banishment and divorce. At least she was free to marry her Count, and she received a small palace and an estate of her own in the Duchy of Altenburg. Duchess Louisa was greatly honored by the population for the rest of her life, but she was not allowed to visit with her adolescent sons Ernst and Albert. Over that, she died in 1831. Lady Sophie, the step-grandmother of the two boys, had become their substitute mother. It was she who imbued particular human values into the young men. Their father limited his paternal influence to occasional breakfasts and hunts. From 1822 till 1835, the two boys spent several weeks every year living with Sophie at the Winter Palace. Her favorite grandchild was Albert, who corresponded with her until her death, addressing her as beloved grandmother, and always signing his letters with your loyal grandchild, Albert. Many years later, he told one of his own children that his childhood was truly miserable. This was an obvious reference to his non-caring father and his absentee mother, but he always adored his beloved step-grandmother. His older brother Ernst described her once, quote, in her long life, she had hardly an enemy and enjoyed a truly legendary veneration until her death. Well, this Ernst had his job cut out for him. Eventually he succeeded his father as the head of his country. Albert, the spare, had to go jump hunting. He decided to get a university education. It probably comes to you as no surprise that this Albert is the one who married Queen Victoria of Great Britain. Engaged in October 1839, he confided in his beloved step-grandmother by writing about the engagement, and I quote, I am absolutely convinced that heaven has delivered me into good hands and that we will be happy together. Since that moment, Victoria has done everything that she could glean from my eyes. Well, the wedding took place in February of 1840. Since Sophie's beloved Albert had moved to London and his older brother Ernst succeeded to his father's throne, she had generously supported the poor in the country, for which she was greatly venerated throughout her lifetime. She endowed at least two schools to educate girls of low-income parents to become respectable employees and thus escape poverty and demeaning occupations. In the city of Altenburg, the girls' school still exists today, 200 years later, and still bears her name, the Carolinum. She also had a couple of hideaway buildings constructed and called them Carolinenfreude, Caroline's Joy. During the summer of 1845, Victoria and Albert took a tour through Germany that included discreet meetings with the Duke of Nassau, the King of Prussia, and most sovereigns who were also members of the so-called Adelsverein, including, of course, the association's past president, Victoria's half-brother, the Prince of Leiningen. They also visited the private castle Rheinstein, constructed by Prince Frederick of Prussia, which had been purchased from a Jean-Jacques von Koll, who, by the way, was in New Braunfels at this very time, helping Germans to settle in that new city. Victoria and Albert also visited Sophie in the Winter Palace. The newspapers noted that Sophie embraced her step-grandson Albert just like a grandmother. She expressed her fondest love and admiration for him. Sophie died on the 22nd of February 1848 at the Winter Palace. She was almost 77 years old. She was buried according to her own wish without a big ado. Today, her grave can no longer be identified. It was during this visit of 1845 that Albert may have become aware of his step-grandmother's tradition of celebrating her birthdays on 11th of July, alone with her butler, but in the spiritual presence of her friends. It is believed that Albert told the story in London, in insider circles, and Albert's private secretary, George Edward Anson, then published this anecdote as part of his memoirs. It is said that the ritual had begun in about 1841 and always included the same 4 invisible friends.
Same procedure as last year, Miss Sophie?
Same procedure as every year, James.
Same procedure as every year, James.
Now, we do not know their names. Over time, the anecdote was picked up, augmented by British-style humor, and relocated to a British country estate. During the 1920s, the concept was adapted for theater production. The English names of the 4 guests are entirely fictitious and without any connection to the historic precedent.
Sir Toby.
Sir Toby is sitting here, Miss Sophie, yes.
Admiral von Schneider.
Admiral von Schneider is sitting here, yes.
Mr. Pomeroy.
Mr. Pomeroy, I've put round here for you.
And my very dear friend, Mr. Winterbottom.
On your right, I'm requesting, Miss Sophie.
Thank you, James.
I've often been asked whether I find this production derisive or insulting, and my answer is a definite no. I usually laugh my head off, although I've seen it more than 50 times already. In fact, I'm very grateful that Queen Consort Albert remembered his beloved step-grandmother. I also take delight in the thought that there might have resounded liberal laughter in the halls of Buckingham and other palaces when he told it. Maybe even the Queen was mused a few times. So, in closing, you may want to remember that her real name was Princess Carolyne, a grande dame who lived through difficult times with all those men around her. Yet she managed to raise Albert to become a stable, respected, and reliable icon in European history. And to that, Princess Carolyne, alias Sophie, I pay my utmost respect.